there were satellites, but there's not a lot of satellite coverage where we were.
Right.
And before the GPSs got really strong, you couldn't reliably use GPSs to like make maps, for example. So we had to make our own maps, like maps by hand. So using trigonometry and Excel and just a compass, and we had cut all the transects or the trails by hand. And it was a lot of work. So we set up a field site across the river, and then I had to get some field assistants and a cook and a security guy, and that was the basis for this, because we could say, okay, genetically, we also had to show that genetically they were very similar. So we did all the genetics of this with using fecal genetics, right?
Right,
so
right.
getting their poop and doing.
You're
some
trying to
analyses
be as unobtrusive as possible.
Yes, you can't have any contact with them.
No
There's
contact.
absolutely not allowed. It'd be illegal. I mean, these are endangered. They really should be called critically endangered, but technically Bornean orangutans are endangered. There's about 54,000 left. There's only about 6,600 left for Sumatrans. But regardless, it's a bad situation because everything's just forest fragments now. So I had this little forest fragment, and I have a picture of that if you ever want to see it. But basically, we were very isolated. So like in the dry season, we couldn't fly out of Borneo. I mean, it was just everything was on fire.
Right.
So I couldn't actually get out of my own field site. We would have had to. We almost evacuated for good. Like we would have left it for good. Because my site
Evacuated
caught
on foot or by
fire.
river?
It would have had to be on foot because we had a little river. In fact, Lading means river.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sungai is river. So it was the river Lading. And so there was this little river that came out from the big river, and at one point we used that. We hooked up a generator to it, and we were able to fight the fire when it happened at one point in 2006, and we were able to get it under control a little bit. But then the fire goes underneath the peat swamp, and then it came back. And when it came back, we lost some more of the site, and then at that point the river was dried up, and so we were trying to decide whether we would have to leave and take the generator and just leave for good and forget the whole thing, or whether we could stay. And then what happened is we heard that Russia was coming with water bombs and that nobody should go outside, and they didn't come, and it turns out they had crashed their planes in Sumatra. And a few months later they came, and they kind of ceremoniously came and scooped up water into the plane and dumped it all over my field site like 7 times. And it turns out that it was already the rainy season, so it wasn't helpful. But they were trying to help.
Wow.
Yeah, they had to go on the provincial capital first because that's where the government is. But anyway, so that was sort of the basis of the site. But you had asked about what you wear. So what you wear is I wear cotton. I mean, things that breathe well, and. But basically, you don't want any of the fancy stuff, and you want to smell really bad. So you want to smell like the forest. Because, of course, you have leeches everywhere, terrestrial leeches. You've got like 7 different species of mosquito. I did have cerebral malaria, but you don't usually get that in the forest. It's usually in the village. But there's all sorts of diseases and things you have to be very careful of. I became severely allergic to a whole family of trees, Anacardiaceae, which is why I'm in zoos now, because it's a whole family of trees that poison ivy is in the family. I never got poison ivy when I grew up in DC. Never got it. Never had a problem. But mangoes are in that family. But then over time, the orangutans love fruit and bark and leaves from some of these species. So you have so much contact to it that the aerosol oil, eventually you can become allergic to it, to the point where about every month I was like, my whole face would blow up, my whole body, it felt like you're being burned alive. So it was pretty awful. So anyway, but you have to be careful, and so you wear these clothes so you kind of smell like the forest. And so
tell me what the forest smells like. I have to explain that with words. I know this is very difficult, isn't it?
Well, I can smell my field data because it still smells like it. There's no way to describe this other than this is what it smells like. Okay, you can sniff that.
Just smelling.
I can smell.
Papers.
No, I smell it. But I think it's a very distinct smell. That's just Indonesia to me. Is this?
It smells very earthy.
Yeah, it's like peaty. Yeah, it smells really bad though. So this is a very faint. Obviously, this is from wasn't in the forest since 2000.
Can Annie take a picture in there?
Oh,
or
sure.
Take a video?
This is
She's videoing now.
This is some data in Indonesian. That basically we can't afford to lose data because that's all that you're doing there. And so we always do it with the clipboard and paper and pen, and we're using space pens because they write upside down and in water. So that's helpful.
Okay.
Because everything gets saturated. It's really horrible conditions. I mean, swamps are really painful.
Do you have an example of a space pen?
Not on me now. I have those at home, but you can get them at REI.
Okay.
And so
I think they also sell them at the Aaron Space.
Aaron Space,
probably.
yeah, that would.
But they're actually really great. I mean, you use them. because the ballpoint pens you can use, but then they just kind of fall apart.
Right.
And so yeah, we have clipboards, and we would just have like Ziploc bags over that. But yeah, I mean, I still have my field clothes. Some of it was really disgusting. But I mean, holes
hang
everywhere,
them in the
leech
house?
stains. No, I just have them at my parents' house. And
Oh.
they just, if I ever go back, I mean, but it's covered in blood. I mean, because leeches, so you're
Right.
kind of bleeding all the time. So it's really gross. I mean,
Okay,
you
now
smell
wait a
bad.
minute. Remember the hidden agenda for this book is to make kids want to be scientists.
Oh yeah, right. So yeah. So let me explain. So how about this? If you want to see animals, if you it's hardcore. This is a kind of hardcore field work. However, the experience of seeing these animals in the wild is so extreme
Right.
that everything else it just doesn't affect you. It doesn't bother you. Now, if you're not as inspired this way, then people leave.
Okay.
You know, so
So
you
be
really have to
prepared
want
for
to.
some hardship if you're
Yeah, I
working
mean, this
in
is
the
very
field.
extreme. Well, it depends on the field, right?
Mhm.
There's people who I know who work with South American monkeys that get to work on a beach and watch little marmosets, and it's easy.
Right.
Somebody on my committee at Duke
Right.
would say, "Oh my God, I can't believe you did any of that," because this is painful and kind of extreme, but you don't feel that. I mean, people would say, "Oh, why don't you leave after you have typhoid, 6 kinds of typhoid?" And because I wouldn't have ever thought to leave, because that's your life and it's something that is, you're doing some real good, and then these animals, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible.
Wow.
And so to see them in the wild is just, and it's not just seeing them, of course, because it's living with them. It's
Right.
like waking up, and when they're really habituated to humans, which I actually tried not to habituate them too much to humans because I knew I had to leave eventually. But we had a female who, I mean, I'd wait for her to wake up and she'd be snoring. She'd have her nest down pretty far, and you could just hear her snoring. And it was just such an incredible experience that we kind of share that space with us, and it's their territory. So you act very differently in the wild than in captivity. So you actually act very submissive around them because they could easily come in and kill you if they wanted to, and you know that. And so you have to act extremely submissive, and that's why I have a hard time looking at people actually straight in their eyes, because I'm so used to looking just right on the side. Because you would never just look straight in the eyes of you do sometimes some of our animals in the zoo, because they get used to looking at humans, and it seems that they actually want to do that. But you often, especially not with the gorillas. You can't
No,
just look
no,
on
I
the
know
side.
the gorillas. You don't make eye contact.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
But yes, no, we, in terms of what you wear, you just want to blend in with the forest. So we really drab colors, nothing really bright. But you don't want to wear, you can't really wear camouflage where I was, because it's, that would be seen badly by certain groups of people. Because you don't want to be associated with
Too
the military.
militant. Okay. So, what about moving through the forest? How did you move? Were you cognizant of making noise?
Yeah, you want to move a very certain way. It depends again on what forest you're in. But in my situation, you wanted to be loud enough that the snakes heard you coming, because they would, like pit vipers, if they're kind of curled up and asleep during the day, you can accidentally trip on them, and that's not pleasant. And then the cobras, you definitely want them to go away, or like pythons. So I would walk loud enough that snakes heard me, but you had to be quiet enough that like people that you didn't want to hear you wouldn't hear you. Because I had an area where I made a buffer zone around my camp, but I did have some concern that I didn't want to run into certain groups of people that, and I didn't have too much of a problem at my site, but when I did my postdoc, we had some hunters who were in the area. So we would actually be at the nest at 3:30, 4 in the morning, and we would sometimes hear like gunshots. And they were hunting sambar deer, but they were extremely close. So that's not very safe when you're there wearing like drab clothing.
Right, exactly.
But you also didn't want them necessarily to come upon you at the wrong time. And it depends on your situation. In Indonesia, I never felt completely unsafe. In Thailand, I did, because there was, and this is not to put in a children's book, but I mean, they were actively killing people. So we had to be quiet enough that they didn't hear us.
Okay.
So you have to be very cognizant of where you're at. Also, if you run into a bear or an elephant, there weren't elephants at my site, but there were in Thailand. But the bear at my site were not harmful, but the same species in Thailand were killing people. So if you run into a bear, that's why I always ran the other direction immediately, and everybody would laugh at me because they were harmless where we were working.
Right.
But it all has to do with the bear's previous experience with humans.
Okay.
And so, yeah, you walk through the forest in a certain way. You don't want to scare the animals, but you want the snakes to hear you coming.
Right. I like that.
When you said you were living amongst the orangutans,
Yeah.
How close were you to them?
So we always try to keep a distance of about like 5 to 10 meters or so, or I try to do about 10 meters, whatever that is in feet. I have to convert. Sorry, I don't think in
That's
anything but
okay.
feet.
That's okay.
It's like
We have
30,
to put
30
we
feet.
put
Yeah.
both in the book. We, metric and,
So usually about 10 meters is a good thing to do in the wild. It's not always possible because sometimes the animals that knew us really well would come down very close. But you always want to maintain that distance because you actually don't. Most people doing field work want the animals to be habituated to the humans who are observing them, but you also want to maintain a healthy distance for possibility of any kind of disease transmission. But of course, also you don't really want them to totally trust humans. And at my site, I actually actively wanted them not to at all,
right.
Because I knew I'd have to leave. So, but you always try to maintain a distance, and you're not allowed to touch them or do anything with them. Now, I was working in completely unprotected areas until I did my postdoc, so it was a national park. We wouldn't have been allowed to touch them at all. So like literally if there was an animal dying, you'd have to watch it die. Now at Tuanen, while I was there, one of the females that we were watching, actually that one in that picture, she was attacked by a clouded leopard and died the next morning, and her infant was clinging to her, and we were able to take her infant and we took her body to a rehab place that we knew, and that Lona actually runs, who's on Orangutan Island, if you've ever seen it. But anyway, so we took the baby to the rehab place, and she ended up dying of a parasite a few years later, but at least we were able to try to do something to help her, because she would have died had it been at that age.
Right.
But that's something you couldn't do in a protected area. So, you can do certain things, but normally you would never touch the animals. They're completely wild and endangered, and you can't do anything. You can't bring them out of the country. It took me 4 years to get permission from Indonesia to bring fecal samples out of the country into Switzerland.
Read Zoo Scientists to the Rescue and lend your voice to saving endangered species. Contact us to find out how to invite Patricia Newman or Annie Crawley to your next event.